In Chapter 3, we learned about job costing, the way companies that make a unique product determine the cost of their product. Chapter 5 deals with process costing. And so process costing is what a company who mass produces a similar type of product. So an example here, we have a furniture company and they make chairs, and every chair is the same. So we don't need to do job costing. We are going to do process costing because every chair goes through the same manufacturing process. And so under process costing, we accumulate the costs by each process or department. And then we determine the cost of the units that we completed by the department based on the average cost. So I think everybody knows how to calculate an average when it comes to calculating your grade. So let's say our exam scores are 90, 80, and 70. What's our average score going to be? Well, we know. We add up our scores. We divide it by the number of scores. So in this case, our average exam score is an 80. And we use that same concept when we're doing process costing. We take the cost of the department, divide it by the units produced, and that tells us the cost to complete one unit. That's our average cost. That's what we use. When we're talking about process costing, we look at the physical flow of materials. So we take the raw materials, we go to the first process where we cut the wood. Then the second process, we assemble. We take the wood and we assemble the chair. And then the third process is we paint the chair, and then the chair is done and it goes into finished goods. So when we're talking about the difference between job and process costing, obviously it's the type of product you're making, a unique product versus a similar product. Job cost, we accumulate the cost on a job cost record. We're assigning the product cost to a job, and then the cost flows into finished goods, and then when the product is sold, the cost flows out of finished goods and into cost of goods sold. Process costing, we're looking at the cost for a series of manufacturing processes. And so the cost from one process, the cost of the units in one process go with the units when they move to the next process. So we're going to see the costs from one department. The first department in the example was cutting. When the units move on to the next department assembling, the costs go into the assembling department. And then the costs are incurred in the assembling department. And now those units have the costs from the cutting and the assembling. They move into the finishing. So the costs are going to move with the units from one process to the next. But still, when we get to the last process, then the costs are going to move into the finished goods inventory. And same with job costing. After finished goods inventory, they move into cost of goods sold. And so when we were talking about job costing, any of the costs that you were putting on the job cost record were also recorded in the work in process inventory account. Under process costing, we are going to have multiple work in process inventory accounts. So each process or department is going to have its own work in process inventory account. So in this example here, the raw materials are going to go into the work in process inventory for cutting. And then when the units are cut, and they move on to the next department assembling, the costs are going to come out of the work in process cutting inventory account and go into the work in process assembling inventory account. When they're all assembled, the units move on to painting, the costs move with the units. They come out of work in process assembling, they go into work in process painting. So that's a big difference between job costing and process costing. And whereas job costing had the job cost report, process costing is going to have a cost of production report for every department. Another thing that's different in process costing is we are going to track direct labor and manufacturing overhead together. We call this conversion costs. So you're going to see when we're tracking costs, we're going to have direct material costs and conversion costs. Another thing that's going to be different with process costing that we did not have under the job costing is equivalent units, right? I said when we're trying to determine the average cost, we're going to take the cost divided by the number of units. Well, if you think about it, at the end of the period, we have some units that are only partially done, right? Those are our ending work in process units. Well, when we're trying to find our average, we can't just take the sheer number of partially completed units. We want to put together those partially completed units and say how many fully completed units would we have if we put these partially ones put together. So an equivalent unit is how many fully completed units would we have if we put the partially completed ones put together. So for example, if we have our ending work in process is halfway done, we have to put two of them together, two partially completed units together to get one equivalent unit. So that's what we're going to be looking at process costing, and we didn't factor that in under job costing. And so I told you we're going to be working with the average. We're going to be using weighted average when we are determining our costs. You could use FIFO. We learned FIFO back in financial accounting with our inventory, where you assume that you complete the ending work in process first. It's more complicated. You would use FIFO if it was going to give you a substantially different amount. We look at the cost benefit, the cost of tracking, the extra time tracking. Is it worth the more precise information? It may be, it may not be. We are going to just stick with the weighted average method because it's simpler. So here's our question. What are conversion costs? A, costs associated with converting raw materials into finished goods. Conversion costs are B, are comprised of direct labor costs and manufacturing overhead costs. C, include all manufacturing costs except for direct materials. And D, all of the above. All of the above are explanations of what conversion costs are. All right. Okay, so let's look at how manufacturing transactions are recorded in a process costing. It's very similar to what we learned under job costing, except we're going to have multiple work in process inventory accounts because every process or department has its own work in process inventory account. So we're looking here at the cutting department. And the work in process cutting department, last period we ended with 15,000 in our work in process. And so that's our beginning work in process for this period. So now we're going to get going, working in the new period. And we start off where 40,000 of raw materials were entered into production. So we learned this journal entry back in job costing. When we take the raw materials inventory goes down with a credit. We debit the work in process cutting department inventory account. And so when we look at the work in process cutting, now we've got a debit of 40,000 to the work in process cutting account. We can see the new balance. Next transaction, we incur direct labor costs of 30,000. So now we're starting to work on cutting the wood. Now the wood was brought in the last transaction. Now we had workers cutting the wood. So we debit work in process cutting, credit wages payable. And we can see the work in process cutting T was debited. Next transaction, 10,000 of manufacturing overhead was allocated to the cutting department. Right? So the manufacturing overhead now was put into the cutting department. So we debit the work in process inventory cutting for 10,000. We credit manufacturing overhead. And we can see the T account, work in process cutting, has been debited. So now we're at the end of the period, and 75,000 was the cost of the units that were completed and transferred to the assembly department. So these costs are going to come out of the work in process inventory for cutting and go into the work in process inventory for assembly. So we can see we debited the work in process assembly, credit work in process for cutting. And so we put the credit on we put the $75,000 on the credit side of the work in process cutting, and add up the debit, subtract the $75,000, we have $20,000. That's our ending work in process for the cutting department. So let's look at how process costing works. So we've got 5 steps in process costing, because we're getting our way down to getting the average cost per unit, and then we apply it to the number of units that we've transferred on. So to start off, we have to make sure we have identified the correct number of units for the department, since that's a very important piece. So we determine the physical units that we're dealing with, and some of the units that we're dealing with are going to be the ending work in process inventory. So those units that are partially completed. Well, we want to spread the cost over fully completed units, so we need to determine the equivalent units. So the first 2 steps are getting the number of units straight. And then the next 3 steps in our 5-step process deal with the cost. So step 3, we got to figure out what's the total amount of costs that we're dealing with in this department. So we're going to have some costs that are in our beginning work in process inventory. So those costs are still with us in this department. Plus, we're going to incur new costs, because then this period, the first thing we did was we finished our beginning work in process, and then we started new ones. So we got to get together the beginning work in process costs plus all of the costs that we incurred during the period. Once we know the total number of costs we are dealing with, and at the end of step 2 we knew how many units we were dealing with, well, then we can get the cost per unit, right? The same way we did with the test scores. Take the total cost, divide by the number of units. And then once you know the cost per unit, we can assign costs to the units that have completed and moved on to the next department. And then we can check the cost that should be in our ending work in process inventory account. So I'll pick up demonstrating how to implement these 5 steps in the next video.